Rackman. The case of the Rackman is one of Australia's most disturbing and enduring unsolved mysteries. In 1994, the discovery of a body bound to a steel frame and submerged in the Hawkesbury River shocked the nation and has since remained a chilling enigma. On August 11th, 1994, a fisherman navigating the Hawkesbury River near Sydney made a grim discovery. Expecting to clear his net of debris, he instead found a human body bound to a crucifix-like steel frame, weighed down with concrete blocks. The precision and deliberate effort to conceal the body were immediately apparent. Authorities determined the victim was male, between 21 and 41 years old and about 1.73 meters tall. Dressed in a t-shirt and shorts, the body showed significant decomposition, suggesting it had been underwater for months, if not years. Despite efforts to identify him through fingerprints, dental records, and early DNA testing, the victim's identity remains unknown. The steel frame itself added a sinister layer to the crime, custom fabricated with industrial skill. It was clear the killer had taken extraordinary steps to ensure the body would remain hidden. This level of planning, combined with the symbolic nature of the crucifix-like frame, pointed to a crime that was not impulsive but calculated and methodical. Speculation about the motives and perpetrators ran rampant. Some theorized the crime was linked to organized crime, given the elaborate measures taken to dispose of the body. The Hawkesbury River had long been associated with illegal activity, including drug trafficking, adding weight to this possibility. Others believed it was a personal act of revenge or punishment, with the crucifix suggesting a deliberate message. Investigators also explored links to missing persons cases, most notably the 1993 disappearance of Max Tenzewski, a suspected drug dealer. While the circumstances of Tenzewski's case seemed to align with the Rackman's fate, no definitive connection was established. Despite significant efforts, the case grew cold. Advances in forensic science, including improved DNA analysis, have been applied in recent years, but without a name for the victim, progress has stalled. The vast and remote terrain of the Hawkesbury River only adds to the challenges, offering few clues or witnesses. Whoever committed the crime knew what they were doing. Every aspect of the disposal was meticulous, suggesting an experienced and calculating perpetrator. Nearly 3 decades later, the Rackman's identity and the circumstances of his death remain a haunting mystery. The crime has become a focal point for true crime enthusiasts and investigators alike, embodying the isolation and lawlessness that sometimes thrive in Australia's vast landscapes. The case endures as a symbol of unanswered questions, a reminder of the fragility of justice and the capacity for violence that lingers beneath the surface. For those who remember the discovery and the families of the missing, hope persists that one day the Rackman will have a name and his story will finally come to light. The dark legacy of Bevan Spencer. Bevan Spencer von Einem's name has become synonymous with a series of horrifying crimes in South Australia during the 1980s. He is one of the most chilling figures in Australian criminal history, and his crimes still send shivers down the spine of those who remember the terror he caused. Von Einem's story is tied to the brutal murders of several young men, with one particularly horrific crime, the murder of Richard Kelvin, leading to his eventual arrest and conviction. Yet, the true extent of his crimes and the horrors he unleashed remain a dark and haunting mystery. In the early 1980s, a disturbing trend began to emerge in Adelaide. Young men were disappearing under strange and eerie circumstances. All were in their late teens or early 20s, and they vanished without a trace, often in public places or near their homes. The disappearances caused a sense of growing unease within the community. But what made these cases so particularly chilling was the fact that none of the victims seemed to have any connection to each other, and their disappearances didn't follow any obvious patterns, except that they were all young, male, and from the same area. The first major case that would draw attention to von Einem was that of 15-year-old Clinton Speedy Durox, who disappeared in 1983. Clinton was last seen leaving a shopping centre in Adelaide, and his disappearance seemed like just another tragic case of a missing teenager. However, as time went on, the case grew colder, and Clinton's family was left without answers. Little did they know this was the beginning of a much darker string of events. Over the next few years, more young men vanished. Among the most notable were 15-year-old Mark Langley and 15-year-old Richard Kelvin. What made these cases even more horrifying was that there was no sign of the boys, no ransom demands, no evidence of struggle. They simply disappeared. In 1989, after years of police investigation, the body of 15-year-old Richard Kelvin was discovered in a remote area outside Adelaide. He had been brutally murdered, his body showing signs of both SA and severe physical trauma. The investigation quickly took a disturbing turn. Richard had been strangled, but not immediately. The coroner found signs that he had been kept alive for some time after his abduction. His cause of death was ultimately determined to be strangulation, but the brutal manner in which he was tortured, seemingly for the perpetrator's sadistic pleasure, was chilling. The pattern that emerged in the case of Richard Kelvin mirrored the previous disappearances. The methodical brutality of the crimes became clearer with each new victim. Investigators started to piece together a dark profile of the killer, a man who not only had a penchant for abducting young men, but who also appeared to enjoy torturing them before ultimately killing them. It was Richard's murder that would ultimately lead investigators to Bevan Spencer von Einem. He had long been known to police for his odd behavior and previous run-ins with the law, but nothing had ever linked him directly to the missing boys. That changed when von Einem's name came up in connection with another abduction. Witnesses had placed him near the scene of one of the missing boys' last known locations. Von Einem was quickly brought in for questioning, and the investigation began to uncover an even darker truth. Von Einem's house was searched, and disturbing evidence was found. Traces of von Einem's DNA were discovered on several of the bodies, including Richard Kelvin's. There were also accounts from survivors who had narrowly escaped the fate of the others, providing harrowing details about what had happened to the boys in the hands of the killer. The survivors spoke of being abducted and held captive by von Einem, sometimes for days, in isolated locations. They described being drugged, bound and tortured. Some spoke of being physically assaulted and forced into horrific acts, their lives hanging by a thread. In the case of Richard Kelvin, investigators learned that he had been kept alive for several days in von Einem's home before being killed. When von Einem was arrested, his defense team attempted to argue that the case against him was circumstantial, that the evidence wasn't strong enough to convict him. But the police had more than just DNA evidence. They had witness testimony, phone records, and a detailed profile that painted a clear picture of a man who had a pattern of targeting vulnerable young men. A pattern that had begun years earlier with the disappearance of Clinton Speedy Drugs. At trial, von Einem's twisted nature came into sharper focus. He was ultimately convicted of the murder of Richard Kelvin, but the other disappearances, Clinton Speedy Drugs, Mark Langley, and others, remained unsolved. Many believed that von Einem was responsible for all of them, but he was never charged with the other murders due to lack of evidence. Still, the evidence against him in the Kelvin case was damning enough to secure a conviction. Despite being sentenced to life in prison, von Einem's case left many unanswered questions. Investigators were unable to conclusively prove that he was responsible for the deaths of all the young men, but the chilling pattern of the murders suggested he had a much wider and more horrific role in the disappearances than initially thought. Some of the missing boys' bodies have never been found, and von Einem has never fully confessed to the extent of his crimes. To this day, the case remains a haunting mystery in South Australia's criminal past. Bevan Spencer von Einem's chilling crimes have left a permanent scar on the community, a dark legacy that still lingers. Though he has been convicted of one murder, there are those who believe that the true number of his victims may never be known. What is certain is that the crimes committed by von Einem, the sadistic torture and killings of young men, will forever remain one of Australia's most terrifying and unsolved criminal mysteries.